Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening. Again, I'm Tracy Austin, the Director of Alumni and Community Relations at Colby-Sawyer. We're thrilled to have so many alumni, faculty, staff, and New London area friends online with us today. Currently, it looks like we have about 64 of you in the audience, which is really great to see, and I anticipate we'll have a few more logging on within the next few minutes. I'm pleased to have Professor Eric Boyer with us to discuss the persistent and impossible dream of political unity. Professor Boyer has been teaching at the college since 2008, and his areas of expertise include American studies, government, history, and philosophy. Anyone who has been in the classroom with Eric can attest to the energy and passion he brings to his teaching, and I'm sure you'll all be witness to that tonight. Before I turn things over to Professor Boyer, I'd like to review the format for today's Zoom presentation. We are recording this presentation and will prepare to share a link of the recording with all of you in the coming days. The microphones and video feeds for all of you in the audience have been disabled for this presentation. If you are having difficulties hearing or seeing us, please send us a message in the text chat. Professor Boyer will plan to make a presentation and share some slides. Immediately following, we will have a question and answer period. Many of you have submitted questions when you signed up for this presentation, and we have those on hand. If you have additional questions, please submit those via the chat text or by using the question and answer function. We'll track those questions as they come in, and we'll try to get to as many of them as time allows. As a reminder, the chat and question and answer functions can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Simply move your cursor or touch your mobile device and those icons should appear. So with that, we'll get started, and I'm pleased to hand over the screen to Professor Eric Boyer.
Well, thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you to everyone who decided to forego the beautiful weather and come to talk about the impossible dream of political unity. Just a brief bit of context on why this topic. When I was originally asked to do one of these workshops, I was trying to think of the proper topic to do. It's clear that this public health crisis has created an economic crisis and a political crisis. So how best to tackle this? And as I was trying to think about how to approach this, Senator Susan Collins came along and gave me a wonderful idea. While debating the first coronavirus relief package, Susan Collins got up to make a statement on the Senate, and she was interrupted by Minority Leader Schumer. And she was outraged at this, and she made a call for unity and for togetherness and what is coming to. And I was initially shocked by her being shocked. It did seem like, given all that has happened in our country in the past couple of years, that this would be the thing that would make Senator Collins erupt in anger, made me laugh. And then that ironic moment was followed by my favorite moment, which was Mitch McConnell vigorously agreeing that the country needs to just come together in the face of this crisis. I have incredible respect for Mitch McConnell as a tactician, but not as a unifying figure. So this really set the shape of the talk that I'm going to give about this persistent call, but an impossible call for unity. And then the topic was really cemented when a couple days later, none other than George W. Bush posted a video calling for the country to put partisanship aside. And no matter what your opinions are on the former president, unifying is not the word that typically comes to mind by both his supporters and his detractors. George W. Bush ran one of the most politically polarizing re-election campaigns in 2004, swift boat veterans for truth, gay marriage bans on state ballots. It was a Karl Rove masterpiece, not exactly a unifying moment. But I found it interesting that in his video calling on Americans to put partisanship aside, George W. Bush called upon our unity after 9/11. And this is very interesting because I find the speech that George W. Bush gave after 9/11 to be a masterstroke of politics. And in that speech, he called on Americans to unify as we did in the face of the communist menace. And if you look back to the speeches presidents gave during the Cold War, they called upon our moment of unity in World War II. And if you look at the speeches that Franklin Delano Roosevelt gives during World War II, He calls on Americans to unify as we did during the Great Depression and as we did during World War I, and so on and so forth, all the way back to the Revolution. So this is this persistent call where a previous moment of unity is evoked to form a call for current unity in the face of crisis. What I want to try to get at in as short a time as I can is the three elements of this issue, which is, why is this call for unity so persistent? Why is this call for unity impossible? And if we can't achieve unity, how could we disagree more productively? What should we do? So before I get to my first slide, I want to try to switch up here, and I'm going to show you something that, if you have seen me, or you're very familiar with this beautiful, wonderful, terrifying slide. Since 1994, the Pew Research Center has been asking voters about their partisanship identification, and then they've been asking them a series of questions to locate their ideological orientation. And what you're seeing in this chart here is the layout of American voters. Now, I went right to the politically engaged electorate, who are naturally more polarized than the general electorate. But what you can see here is, in 1994, your median Democrat is a little bit liberal. Your median Republican is kind of conservative. But what I want you to show you is, over time, how this shifts. So in 1999, we're starting to see a bit of a separation between these median voters. And then, as we get into the Iraq War and the George W. Bush presidency, we start to see a shift to the left. This continues into 2011. Now we're really starting to see a troubling phenomenon. This is the phenomenon that we're living in now, which is a real collapse of the center. Your median Democrat is moving to a more consistently liberal direction. Your median Republican is moving more consistently conservative. In 2014, we start to see this process continue. 2015, and then in the era of Donald Trump, this is where we are now. This is, I am a big fan of apocalyptic zombie films. So when I use this term, know that I mean it seriously. This is a wonderfully cataclysmically scary chart. This shows a country that has no middle anymore. The center has dropped away. So your median Democrat is now, according to what the Pew Research Center calls liberal, very consistently liberal. Your median Republican is very consistently conservative. And there are very few voters who sit in this middle ground. Here you can see the death of the liberal Republican and the death of the conservative Democrat. They just don't exist anymore. So I find it a bit strange that anyone would, with a straight face, call for unity in this moment. I just share my screen again, apologies, would call for unity in this particular moment, given the reality that many of these politicians have helped create. Let me see if I can get back to my PowerPoint. There we go. So what I want to do is I want to try to just sketch out as briefly as I can, and this is the moment where all of my former students snicker, because it is a common thing I say in class. This should take 5 minutes, and then 50 minutes later, we finally conclude. What I want to try to do while I wait for this PowerPoint to load up is discuss, why is this so persistent? Then I want to get into what I think is the real innovation of American political thought, which is that unity is impossible. From there, I want to discuss what we can do in this situation. If unity is impossible, if our system demands conflict and difference, then what could we do differently so that we can disagree more productively? So my quick and simplified look at the history of this concept, I wanted to start with Plato's Republic, because I think there's this wonderful moment in Plato's Republic where a character emerges as a foil for Socrates. So Plato is writing a dialogue in which Socrates is investigating what is justice. And early in this dialogue, one of the people at this gathering erupts in anger. This individual is named Thrasymachus. And he believes that he has the answer to what is justice. So in ancient philosophy, they wouldn't frame a question of unity as unity. They framed it as, what is justice? Because once we know what justice is, we will all unify around that concept and we will move forward. So Thrasymachus, in a classic, violent, angry, enraged 2020 American voter way, erupts at Socrates, interrupts the people that are talking, and attempts to violently, I guess we would say, mansplain justice to Socrates. And he says, oh, you're such a buffoon, Socrates. I know what justice is. Justice is power. And he says, justice is what is done by the strong. Justice is whatever the ruler does and gets away with, essentially. So justice has no fixed meaning. There is no sense of the common good that we can all unite around. Justice is what the ruler does, as long as the ruler gets away with it. This is a very modern concept. Thrasymachus is a man ahead of his time in this sense. And he quickly gets shot down by Plato. By Socrates, who is being written by Plato. And in the Republic, Socrates says, oh, no, you're wrong, Thrasymachus. This is totally incorrect. The powerful only ever act in the interests of the weak. So what does the shepherd care about? The shepherd cares about the sheep. What does the doctor care about? The doctor cares about curing sickness. So what does the politician care about? The politician cares about ruling the subject. A politician, in their role as politician, cannot possibly care about their own self-interest, because the very definition of being a ruler is that you care about the ruled. Because this is Plato's book, Plato gets to set up the tale, and eventually everyone agrees with Socrates and says, oh my gosh, you're right, Socrates. Even Thrasymachus starts to participate in the conversation, and they all come up with this idea of what the perfect society would look like. And so in this perfect society, Socrates sets up three parts and says, okay, if there is this thing called justice, who would know what it is? Well, philosophers would know what it is. I'm a philosopher. I know what justice is. I think I and people like me should be in charge. So he sets up these three sections of the city. We have the kings, who are philosophers. We have a military who show courage. And then we have the people, the producers, everybody else. So what Socrates, being written by Plato, says is that unity arises, justice emerges when each person does their job and nothing else. So when producers produce, when the guardians guard, and when the rulers rule, that is when we will get a perfect, unified social order. This concept is quickly challenged by Plato's student Aristotle, who wants to study politics not as an outgrowth of philosophy, but as an outgrowth of the emerging natural sciences. And so Aristotle says, we shouldn't be setting up this fictional society in which the philosophers are in charge. Instead, we should look at what really is, and then try to categorize, try to generalize. Aristotle is the father of many academic disciplines, one of which is political science. And so the way Aristotle sets these things up is by saying, okay, well, there are three different types of political systems. We can have rule by the one, rule by the few, or rule by the many. And what we get is good versions of these societies: monarchy, a good version of rule by the one; aristocracy, a good version of rule by the few; or polity, a good version of rule by the many. But unfortunately, these societies can be corrupted. As we start to govern not according to the public interest, but the self-interest, monarchy becomes tyranny, aristocracy becomes oligarchy, polity becomes democracy. What's interesting about this, from my vantage point, is that for the next 1,500, really 1,600 years, we don't alter this framework. We still, up until really the Enlightenment and the American Revolution, we still ask the question, what kind of politics is it? Is it ruled by the one, ruled by the few, or ruled by the many? Is the government oriented to the public interest or self-interest? This continuance of the framework only has one aberration, and it's an aberration I really love, and that is the work of Machiavelli in his book, The Prince. And Machiavelli flips the script on Plato and on Aristotle and Augustine and all of these ancient and early modern theorists. They want to talk about virtue. Machiavelli wants to talk about what he calls virtu. And virtu is to be roughly translated as political skill. So for Machiavelli, effective ruling creates a kind of unity, but a unity that comes from awe, a unity that is kind of like a charlatan's trick. So virtu is this kind of manly courage, ambition, yearning and striving, and skill and cleverness. So in his handbook for rulers, Machiavelli famously says, a ruler needs to learn how to be bad. A ruler needs to learn how to appear to be virtuous, appear to be generous, appear to be magnanimous, but actually be cruel, deceptive, manipulative, violent. You need to trick the people because the people are fickle, they are ignorant, they are envious, so you're never going to get them to unify. Machiavelli notes correctly that all of these political systems which are aspiring to unity are really built on lies, myths, and overpowering force to keep people in their place. So Machiavelli just leans into this and says, let's pretending that we're working towards justice, or we're working towards something higher. Let's be honest. I am writing to you, the ruler, because you want power and you want to keep your head. If you want to do these things, aspire not to virtue, aspire not to unity in any real sense, aspire to virtu. I moved one ahead. As you can imagine, Machiavelli created a bit of a splash with this, and it didn't really impact political science until much later. Machiavelli was a man way before his time. He was a modern theorist writing for an early modern crowd. The next big moment in this search for unity, from my vantage point, is the social contract theories of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Each of these theorists say, okay, I have this idea. If we treat politics like a contract, that is the thing that can bring us together. That is what we can unite around. So to take these three theorists and simplify them a lot, for Thomas Hobbes, you need to have force and obedience because equality leads to us murdering each other. When we don't have a government to keep us in line, we desire everything. We go after everything. So if this is the case, if human beings are violent, angry, ignorant, desiring machines, the only thing that will keep us from murdering each other is what Hobbes calls a mortal god, a leviathan, who will establish order and command total obedience. This is what will unite us. This is what turns a squabbling group of desiring violent machines into a coherent nation. That is the only thing that will work. There is no higher order. There is no higher truth. As Hobbes famously says, the only thing that works for monarch is the absence of a monarch. So no matter how bad your monarch is, what would be worse is the absence of that monarch. So you can think of something like Iraq after Saddam Hussein, or Syria during the Civil War. Hobbes would say the only thing worse than Syria under President Assad is Syria without President Assad, because it's civil war. Locke comes along and says, you have it all wrong, Hobbes. Before we have a government, we are not murdering each other. This state of nature that exists before government is not this dystopian, apocalyptic wasteland of death. It is instead inconvenient. It is instead uncertain. It is hard to advance oneself. It's hard to protect your life. It's hard to protect your liberty. And most importantly, it's hard to protect your property when there is no police force, when there is no law. So Locke says, we join together to get rid of these inconveniences of the state of nature. And what unites us is a commitment to these natural, inalienable rights, rights that rise above politics. And those are life, liberty, and property. To protect this unifying thing, we need a balanced, moderate government where the majority rules. This is very much the theorist who inspires our system after the American Revolution, with a couple of changes that I'll get to in a bit. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the inspirer of the French Revolution, and he takes issue with both Hobbes and Locke and says, no, what unites us is the common good, or what Rousseau calls the general will. And Rousseau really does believe that there is this thing called the general will, and this is the will of all. It is not simply the will of the majority. The will of the majority is simply a calculation of individual wills. It is posing a question, counting votes on one side, counting votes on the other, and allowing that to be the deciding force. That is not what Rousseau means. That is simply an accumulation of individual opinions. Rousseau believes that in our role as a citizen, when we are governing ourselves, we need to take the vantage point of the whole. And if we do this honestly, we will see emerging something that represents the common interest. And we will agree with almost unanimity. In a well-functioning society, Rousseau believes that most political questions should have very few dissenters, because we should all be, and to use a modern framing of this, we should all be on the same page. We should all be, clicking in the same way, understanding what's in the general will. As you can imagine, when Rousseau's ideas are implanted into France during the Revolution, this can lead to some rather violent moments, because Rousseau says, if you disagree with the general will, you will be forced to do what the general will says you should do. And this is nothing more than forcing you to be free, right? So when I look online now, I see store employees and angry maskless customers. I keep thinking of Rousseau, right? I can't wait for one of them to pull out the social contract and say, I am simply forcing you to be free by making you wear a mask. This is a radical notion of what unity entails. Unity is the common good. You either get on board or you are put to death if you refuse to consent to and submit to the general will. Well, what then does that lead us to? It leads us to a persistent idea that if only we put politics aside, we would come up with what the general will is. If only we would stop being politicians, we could all agree. This idea was present in the colonies at the time of the Revolution. The American Revolution was fueled by this idea that the British Parliament could no longer govern in the best interests of the colonies, that we were two radically different people. We didn't want to be represented in their parliament. That was a foreign parliament. The only thing that united us was the monarch, and we didn't need a monarch. So the American Revolution was really a revolution that was inspired by this idea of achieving the common good by allowing the people to rule. We were still accepting Aristotle's framework. We are either going to be ruled by the one, the many, the one, the few, or the many. So instead of being ruled by the one, British monarch, and the few, British parliament, we would be ruled by ourselves. And once the people are in charge, we will naturally agree, because why would the people willingly do something bad to themselves? So the early constitutions after the Revolution and the Articles of Confederation are oriented around a radical Whiggish conception of politics, which is how can you closely represent the people? The more closely the people are represented, the more likely it is the common good will emerge. So we had things like very weak governors, 1-year terms for elected officials, recall, restrictions on terms, so mandatory rotation in office. We had binding instructions where a community could send their representative to the state legislature and tell them how to vote on issues, with the idea being, if we have a legislative branch that closely mirrors the populace, the people will rule, the public good will emerge, unity will arise. Well, as you can imagine, this didn't happen. It didn't happen because it turns out the people don't agree on what should be done. When we had a political system that put the people in charge in a very real and very radical sense, given the restrictions of the time, white males are the only ones voting, even in the most democratic constitution, which was Pennsylvania's. There was conflict. The public good did not emerge. It turned out legislative branches would often do ridiculous things that were clearly just pacifying the angry populace. And so we started to see real pessimism, despondency emerge amongst the political elites of these early American states. And they started to say, oh my gosh, are we just not capable of freedom? Are we not virtuous enough to be free? And a number of people said, okay, well, we need to be better. We need to reform human nature. We need to return to religion. We need to turn to education. We need to teach people to be public-minded. This sounds great, but it is incredibly difficult to do. That strain of what is typically called evangelical republicanism was oriented towards reforming our schools. What I want to focus on is what I think is the real innovation of American political thought, which is the other strain of this, which is called legal republicanism. And according to a legal Republican like James Madison, we cannot change human beings. As he famously says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So what do we need to do? If we can't rule a virtuous people, we need to figure out how do we effectively rule a non-virtuous people. And so what we get is the American Constitution. At the Constitutional Convention, 2 different plans were proposed. Again, flashbacks for all of my students who had me in con law. Terrible memories are emerging right now. We had the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. In a typical American history class, these are presented as the big state plan, the Virginia plan, and the small state plan, the New Jersey plan. That is absolutely true. But what I find more interesting is not what made them different, but what made them the same. Both of them were carrying over the assumptions of Aristotle, the assumptions of the American Revolution, which is how do we closely mirror sentiments and inclinations of the people? Now, do we do this in a way that favors the big states, or do we do this in a way that favors the small states? Both the Virginia and New Jersey plan created very quick-moving, responsive political regimes. What we get with Roger Sherman's Great Compromise, when Roger Sherman proposes taking the Virginia plan, taking the New Jersey plan, and smushing them together, is we get this beautifully complicated, really clumsy, clunky system called the American system of government. We have a House of Representatives, which is closely bound to the people. We have a Senate, which is distant from the people. We have an executive who is indirectly elected through the wonderfully archaic Electoral College. We have state governments interacting with the federal government. We have local governments interacting with the state government. And when charged to defend this wonderfully complicated system to a very skeptical public, remember, a public who was told just 15 years ago that the reason why we can't have the British Parliament anymore is because it's clunky and doesn't represent us. Madison constructs this wonderful articulation of republicanism in the Federalist 10 and the Federalist 51. And what he says in these articles is, you're never going to get unity. You're never going to get unity. Anytime a people has freedom, they're going to disagree. It is built into our human nature. We will never agree. So we cannot try to stamp out disagreement, or as Madison calls it, faction. We can't stamp it out. The only way you could stamp it out is through authoritarianism, is through the Bashar al-Assad method of stamping out dissent, or the Chinese Communist Party method of stamping out dissent, surveillance and coercion. Instead, we need to manage it. And the way we're going to manage it is by having precisely this incredibly complicated system where different institutions are representing different constituencies on different electoral time clocks with different incentives. And here is the hope. The hope is that when you have all of these ambitious individuals and they are pitted against each other, they will be forced to do the right thing. Because if they do the wrong thing, they will be voted out. When our system is working well, that's how it's supposed to work. Even if I am a horrible, corrupt, ambitious, self-seeking politician, I know the only way to get that political office is by exposing the ambition and corruption of my opponent, and then hopefully doing the right thing. And if I cheat, I need to make sure I do it really secretly, because the American people get really upset when they think their government is cheating. So in this way, a good system turns rotten politicians into virtuous public servants, not because their soul has changed, but because they are self-seeking, because they are ambitious. They have to do the right thing. I'm reminded here of someone like Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was an incredibly flawed human. Listen to the tapes he made of himself. But he was also ambitious. And his ambition led him to take risks that ended up being wonderfully virtuous. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. Johnson really put his political legacy on the line here. So as much as we look at the actions of the civil rights movement, we need to also understand that this only worked because of ambitious politicians who saw their ambition linked to doing the right thing. So when our system is working, I'm going the wrong way here. When our system is working, it's supposed to work as a kind of cauldron of disagreement in which the good idea emerges. Well, I want to make the claim, so far I've said nothing new. All I have said is our system thrives in disagreement. You could have read that anywhere. I want to make a bolder point, which is that unity is actually dangerous. And anyone who successfully creates unity, anyone who successfully shuts off politics and ends disagreement is actually doing something dangerous. And I could easily look to a place like Hungary right now. What we're seeing in Hungary is the death of a democracy in the name of unity. Viktor Orban is dismantling democracy, getting rid of the independent judiciary, getting rid of elections, getting rid of a free media in the name of combating the coronavirus. It's terrifying stuff. But I actually want to look at something a bit closer to home, and that is the F-35. There is this trend that's occurring. As we become, as a whole, more distant from the military, what I mean by that is fewer and fewer Americans have a direct relationship to a person in the military. As we get more distant from the military, our support for the military becomes more energetically expressed, but more empty of content. Everyone supports the troops, right? If you're a fan of BoJack Horseman, think episode 2, when BoJack accidentally says he doesn't support the troops and everyone in the country freaks out. I realize I just made a BoJack Horseman reference, so I apologize if that's not a reference you get. Beautiful, wonderful show. Everyone supports the troops. But what does that mean? What that means is we don't look at the Pentagon's budget. We don't ask hard questions. We don't challenge appropriators for fear of being accused of not supporting the troops. And what we get is something like the multi-trillion-dollar debacle that is the F-35. It is a fighter plane that the military doesn't want. It's a fighter plane that is still not able to function. And it has cost over $1 trillion. And every time the funding comes up, it gets supported. Why? Because very few individuals have the courage to challenge it for fear of being called out as not supporting the troops. And more than that, there is this wonderful political logic at play here, if I can get my map up, what I want to show you is a map of where the F-35 is made. This is a map of where the F-35 parts are made. And what Lockheed Martin did so successfully is create the illusion of unity by making it within the self-interest of all of these representatives to support $1 trillion waste of taxpayer money. I'm just clicking on Connecticut and New Jersey. Look at all of these companies that are producing parts for the F-35. If I am the member of the House of Representatives from, let's say, Middletown, New York, when the F-35 comes up for reauthorization, I'm not thinking about unity or counterterrorism. I'm thinking about all of the people who work at Pratt & Whitney, good paying jobs. If the F-35 is canceled, they lose their job. I will be out of office. What we're looking at here is what unity looks like when it goes awry. No one dares challenge the Pentagon. So then what defense contractors do is they use the logic of our system to waste your money. Not the same as being incarcerated in Hungary for criticizing the rulers, I understand that. But we are talking about a profound waste of taxpayer dollars. So what could we do? What we could do differently is we could try to utilize the logic of what we see here to improve our outcomes. Let me try to bring back my, oh, and of course I lost it again. As you can see, I am still not a Zoom expert, despite all of my practice. You'd think I'd be better at this point. I want to try to wrap things up here. I want to try to wrap things up, but I want to get back to this. What could we do? A number of participants prior to the start of this talk asked a version of this question. How could we do things differently? And what I want to do is I want to ask the question, how could we disagree in a more productive way? If unity is impossible, if unity is in fact potentially dangerous, what could we do to disagree in a more productive way? And I want to make a couple of suggestions. First, electoral system reform. I don't mean voter turnout. My worry is that voter turnout is a good thing, but if voters are turning out for a system that gives us bad outcomes, we're just going to get a more exacerbated bad outcome. That chart I showed you from the Pew Research Center of our polarized America, there is an institutional foundation to this. And I want to go quickly. I promised Tracy I'd be 40 minutes, and I'm already at 40. Our single member district system is a winner-take-all system. The most votes wins. In that kind of a system, we get two parties. In our primary systems, only the most ideologically engaged voters vote in primaries. So now we have the most ideological voters choosing who's on the ballot. We have an electoral system that says the winner, the most votes, wins all of the representational power. And then with that, we add on gerrymandering. Who draws the lines of the districts? Politicians. I have two of my favorite gerrymanders here. They are beautiful. I want to put them up on my wall as works of art, especially this one right here. A politician draws the lines to maximize their chance of being reelected. So what we get is this collection of non-competitive races. According to the Cook Political Report, just under 390 House elections in 2020 are not competitive by any stretch of the imagination. The incumbent is going to win with 60 or more % of the vote with no possibility of that being altered. So what do we get? We have a system in which the only really competitive election is the primary election. If I am from this district right here on top, I know that if I'm the incumbent, I'm going to win 70% of the vote. This crazy district was drawn to make sure that happens. So the only person I fear is a more ideologically extreme member of my own party who will whip up the primary voters of my party to vote me out in the primary. Ask Eric Cantor, who was once a very conservative member, majority leader of the House, and was primaried by a more conservative candidate. So then how do I govern? I govern in the most ideologically extreme way I can to avoid being voted out. The logic of our system is being twisted. Now it is not in my self-interest to find common ground. It's in my self-interest to throw bombs. So what could we do? We could reform gerrymandering. We could take it out of the hands of politicians. We could change our primary system. We could do things like the top two primary, where the top two vote getters in the primary move to the general election, even if they are both from the same party. So you will frequently get a Democrat running against a Democrat, a Republican running against a Republican. What does this help us do? It helps the parties engage the various parts of their constituencies so that we don't become these homogenous tribes. What else could we do? We could change our single-member district plurality voting system. We could follow the good people of Maine and do ranked choice voting. Any alteration to our system would move us in the direction of making it logical and in your self-interest to compromise. I want to end with a nod to Aristotle, right? As much as I am a legal Republican, as much as I am a cynic about human beings, I agree with Machiavelli, right? Humans are fickle, we're envious, we're wonderfully awful. So I agree that we need to manage people as they are, not hope they become better. But one thing we could do, what would virtue look like in our system? I say know yourself and know your fellow citizen. And what I mean by that is think about your own ideological lens. That Pew Research chart, I want to take issue with the Republican and Democrat element of it, but also the conservative and liberal elements of it. I don't think any American voters know what conservative means or what liberal means or what socialist means. And I think if voters did a little bit of self-reflection and a little bit of looking into it, they might find that they are much more complicated than what they thought they were. If we reformed our elections and we loosened the grip of two homogenous political parties, and if we also understood ideology, and I have just a little chart of what an ideology does. It formulates who is the agent, what are the obstacles, and what is the goal. If you are able to fill this chart in for yourself, and you are able to see how others fill in this chart, you have these beautiful moments. I once had a student who was a very avowed socialist, and after reading Edmund Burke, had kind of a crisis of faith and said, oh my gosh, I agreed with Burke at some elements. I agreed with this old traditional conservative when he was talking about community and he was talking about tradition and trying to mobilize people around things that are worth defending. This is why I'm a socialist. Am I really a conservative? And what I told her is, no, you're just a more thoughtful socialist who understands that being a socialist doesn't mean that you are fundamentally opposed to everything about conservatism. Likewise, there was once a time where there were feminist conservatives, environmental conservatives. There were conservative socialists. There were socialist evangelical Christians who had a whole thing called liberation ideology. We've lost that. And now we've got these two buckets, and really they become dominated by persons. So now you either love Donald Trump or you hate Donald Trump. And then from that, all the elements of your identity are filled in. 538 had a terrifying article that showed people are changing the way they describe their core identity to match their partisanship. So if you are a Republican Christian, you are more likely over time to add evangelical to your self-description of your Christianity because you believe that that's what you should be if you're a Republican. Likewise, if you're a Christian Democrat, you are more likely to drop evangelical from your name, from your self-identity, because you don't think you would belong in the Democratic Party if you were evangelical. That is a scary thing when partisanship is the only identity that matters. So I went 46 minutes, Tracy. I'm very sorry. Thank you for your patience. I am very interested in questions. Happy to engage with whatever it is that people are interested in. Yeah, I'll let you start asking questions, Tracy. I think you're muted right now.
Yep, I'm sorry. I just caught that. I thought I hit the button. Sorry, everyone. Thanks again, Eric, for such a great presentation. We certainly have a number of questions, some that we had on hand that were posed beforehand, and a number that have come in just tonight. So we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. So let's see what we can get through. And
I'll be quick, I promise.
Great. So the first question, the writer asks, if humans have a misplaced nostalgia for unity in a time of crisis, I assume that indicates a human need for a sense of community, even if, time and time again, that unity reveals itself to be base partisanship. But a crisis usually calls for a centralized response, either at the federal or local levels. So is unity a necessary evil, or can we use it as a leverage to identify the social inequalities that a crisis reveals?
This is a really great question, and it reminds me of what Plato said about the Republic when he said we have these noble lies that we're going to tell, right? So we need to govern according to justice. The people will never consent to this. So let's make up a few lies for the good of them. Berg talked about pleasing illusions. These are things that we tell ourselves because it makes life bearable, but they're not really true. And in many ways, this idea of unity and this appeal to a previous moment of unity is a pleasing illusion. And I'm thinking about Lincoln. To show how unified the country was, Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson as his vice president, a Democrat from Tennessee, probably thinking, yeah, the guy is not very stable. Yeah, he's a white supremacist. He might have a drinking problem, but what could possibly happen? He's just the vice president. It was probably the single worst decision Lincoln made. In this attempt to show how unified the country was, he chose Andrew Johnson as his vice president. So it is this need. But I think the question really gets at something crisis can do. Crisis can show us flaws in the system we previously didn't see. And I think the coronavirus is showing people that many of our safety net structures are dysfunctional. They were never designed to be functional. And people who never thought they would have to use the unemployment system are having to use the unemployment system. And they're for the first time realizing that oftentimes states engineered their system to lower their unemployment figures. And I'm going to call out Florida here. By design, the system was designed to be dysfunctional so that the number of unemployed would look low. Many white-collar professional workers are for the first time realizing what it's like to be on the margins. My hope would be that this leads to those citizens being engaged on those issues, not because they've become better people, but because they now see their own self-interest, their own interest linked up with this broader public interest. That's the Madisonian system, linking self-interest to the public interest.
Great. Another question from a writer says, is it political unity itself necessary, or is political agency in itself also necessary? Many of our most revered presidents are those who utilize their power forcefully and sometimes unconstitutionally. They receive backlash, but are remembered fondly and is seen as the great positions of their times, whereas more appeasing leaders are forgotten as weak.
Yes, this is a wonderful question because it really does get at the nature of the American presidency. Our system is this beautiful system where we demand difference, we demand disagreement, we require it, but we still call for unity. And so what we get is in one of my classes I call the paradox of the presidency. So our best presidents are seen as these unifying individuals when actually they are ruthlessly partisan. With hindsight, we look back and say, oh my gosh, if only we could be, a unifier like FDR or a unifier like Lincoln, or, have the genius of Jefferson, have the energy of a Teddy Roosevelt. We have these mythological understandings of our presidents. And we want a president to unify us, yet simultaneously pursue a partisan agenda. And this is the trap Barack Obama fell into. He ran as a unifier. He was going to get rid of partisan politics. Yet, in the next breath, he would propose a radical overhaul to our healthcare system. You can't do both. You can't do both. And so you're either going to unify us by pursuing nothing ambitious, and we will all agree on your empty policies, or you're going to actually try to do the things you promised voters you would do, and then you're going to divide us because we just don't agree on things. And so this is why it's so hard to be the president. This is why Donald Trump is not new. He simply doesn't try to navigate this tension. I think even the fans of the president would agree. He doesn't try to find common ground. He doesn't try to create the appearance of moderating. He doubles down and triples down. He fires up the base. He is a partisan warrior. And unlike our previous partisan warriors, he doesn't pretend to be something different. Many of our successful presidents were partisan warriors masquerading as unifiers. And with hindsight, we drop the partisan warrior parts and remember the unifiers. And I would just say this for closing. If you think Lincoln was a unifier, ask any Democrat who ran a competitive election in the 1864 election. Lincoln had one of them incarcerated because he was worried that the Republican would lose. He gave furloughs to troops from from sympathetic troops to give them furloughs to go home to vote to make sure Republicans would win. I mean, we love Lincoln, but he wasn't a unifier. He was a crafty partisan politician who knew how to dress up his partisanship the right way. And the questioner's right. Many of the things he did were blatantly unconstitutional. Afterwards, we said, I'm glad he did it. But at the time, he was called a despot.
Great. So a question from one of your former students, Eric. He says, which other US president may compare, or at least come somewhat close, to Trump in his art of never backing down and fighting back against the press, the media, his opposition, and even his own party members?
So I want to thank Boris first. Shout out to Boris for this question. I hope life is treating you well. I'm not sure where you are, but I hope life is treating you well. This is a great question, right? Because we've had many kind of sort of ruthless politicians, but to get to you can't compare Trump to anyone prior to Nixon. And I say this because Nixon was original in the sense that Nixon perfected the art of the continuous campaign. Nixon's real innovation in American politics, and not all innovations are good, was this idea that you are always campaigning. You are never governing as a thing that is separate from campaigning. You govern like it's a campaign. And every politician, with maybe the exception of Jimmy Carter, but Jimmy Carter changed his outlook. If you look at early Carter with the cardigan sweaters and the fireside chats, that bombed. So then near 1979, we get power suit Jimmy Carter, Oval Office. Even Carter learned that you need to be aware of the campaign, even while you're governing. So I think it's Nixon. But what Nixon didn't have was a sympathetic news media. Nixon didn't have that. So no one came to his defense when it started to unravel. What Trump had, what modern presidents have, is a partisan media. So no matter what you do, one half of the media spectrum is going to rise to your defense and is going to defend you. And this is something that benefits Republicans when they're in office and Democrats when they're in office. There's nothing you can do that they won't come to your side. Nixon didn't have that. Nixon didn't have Breitbart. He didn't have a One America News Network or Fox to come to his aid. He was left to dry, hang out to dry. So I think we see what Nixon would have looked like if he had had a sympathetic media outlet. When we see Trump's constant campaigning, I mean, he's always campaigning. He's mobilizing constituencies. He's managing the messaging. That's a very Nixonian idea. And so I would say it's Nixon, but only because no previous president had the media scrutiny or the idea that you are continuously running a campaign.
Great. So we have another question that came in through our Q&A function. And the writer says, if Hobbes and Locke are so different, why is it that they are often seemingly referred to in tandem? In American history classes, one always hears about Hobbes and Locke.
Oh, it's a great question. Hobbes is often called a liberal, which makes me laugh, right? Because Hobbes is more of a fascist than he is a liberal. But what Hobbes and Locke both did that makes them similar enough that I joke that they are like the LMNOP of political theory. It's Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, right? They're always together. They're the three amigos. What Hobbes did was challenged the rule of the monarch by saying, you don't naturally get to rule because God gave you this right. Your power as a monarch needs to be explained scientifically. And the moment you do that, the moment you investigate the monarch with a scientific lens, and Hobbes thought he was a scientist. He thought he was looking at this with the cold, calculating look of a scientist. Once you look at the monarch through a scientific lens, monarchy falls apart pretty quickly. You can ask French kings during the Revolution, right? The moment the Enlightenment cast its gaze on monarchy, it starts to fall apart. So this is why, despite his rather fascist conclusions, Hobbes is considered the early liberal because he was asking the questions that lead to liberalism. Why does the king have power? What does the king do? What is the king's function? Why do we have one? And the moment you start asking those questions, you quickly get away from Hobbes's answer and you get into the answers that Locke, Rousseau, Madison start to give. And we get to what we would call democracy now. We don't need a king. We need to manage our own conflict.
Okay, and going back to a little bit earlier in your presentation, we had an alum say, "What do you think Rousseau would say to Marx in terms of the will of the people?"
Yes. Oh man, my favorite people. So Rousseau and Marx, it's a very interesting relationship, right? Because Marx believes that he is governing in the general will. He doesn't use this language, but he believes that his revolution is going to lead to the triumph of the general will. Marx is in many ways, we read Marx through the people that came after. We read him through Engels. We read him through Marxists. And I would make the claim that Marx is way more interesting and complicated than Marxists made him out to be. They turned a really complicated system of thought into a pamphlet, into a slogan. But for Marx, he was always conflicted about this because he really thought that there was a thing called the interest of everyone. It was the good of everyone, and we would embrace it when the downtrodden seized power. But he was also aware that people could be tricked. People could act in ways that are against their own interests. And so he was very interested in educating people, in mobilizing people, in spreading his philosophy. And so there is a relationship here. There is this idea that they both have a kind of quasi-religious view of politics. Once the scales are lifted from our eyes, we will act in the common good and we will all work together. But anyone who's lived in a Marxist regime will tell you they are not unified regimes in any sense other than the way Hungary is becoming unified, the way Bashar al-Assad is trying to unify. So they're both these deeply problematic philosophers. And I think it might be because, dare I say, maybe the public interest doesn't exist. Maybe there is not a thing that we can all rally around, or the moment we do, we immediately find something else to disagree on. So we will never get to a moment where we all have the scales ripped away from our eyes and we all link arms, and sing. I don't think that's ever going to happen. And so I think having that as a goal sets you up for either disappointment or authoritarianism, because you're either going to never achieve unity or you're going to achieve it in the way Stalin achieved unity, or Pol Pot, by murdering people who disagree. And neither one of those options works for me, disillusionment or tyranny. And so I feel we need to be more comfortable with disagreement and find ways to disagree more productively. That would be my hope.
Great. Well, we're quickly running out of time, so I do want to at least get in one more question. I'm sorry,
Please.
We're not going to be able to get, the questions are really pouring in, and I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But let's have one more question before we kind of close up here. So we have an alumnus who writes, "In modern political journalism, we often see this somewhat insincere both sidesism proposed by some of the mainstream media. They try to pass it off as unbiased, but it doesn't seem to be fooling the American public. How do we fix this, and what suggestions would you give to those trying to find the plain Jane vanilla news in this modern clickbait world?"
This is another really good question. I want to give two answers, one of which is going to be very unsatisfying, and the other will hopefully be a bit more satisfying. The first would be, I want to push back against the idea that the media will save us. And what I mean by this is I frequently hear, "Oh, if only we could keep the Russians from interfering with our election. Oh, if only we could make the partisan news media present the truth, then everything would be different." I don't believe that's we are not going to be saved by some kind of white knight coming in on a horse, whether that is Mark Zuckerberg cracking down on fake news, or whether it's a return to the equal time rule by the FCC. That's not going to save us. We are only going to be saved when we become more critical consumers of the news. And I realize this makes me sound like a utopian. I worry that we have at our disposal an incredibly powerful machine of information gathering, and we are completely incapable of managing it. It is like I would give the keys to my car to my 4-year-old, right? It is a powerful machine, and my 4-year-old is incapable of operating it safely. So I really do fear that we will not get better at this until we become more discerning and be able to look at something that is clearly Russian propaganda and say, "I don't really think that sounds right. I really don't think 5G networks are giving us COVID-19, right? I don't really think Bill Gates is engineering a genocidal project to make me buy a patented vaccine. That just doesn't sound like correct." Until we become a bit more credulous, we're going to continue down this road. in the meantime, while you're waiting for everyone to become a little bit more credulous, there are sites. I would say one would be, have a wide variety, have a wide diet. Go to the Huffington Post, go to Fox News, go to Politico, go to Real Clear Politics, go to 538, try to vary your diet. In the same way that if all you eat is carbs, you're unhealthy. If all you eat is partisan media from Facebook, you are going to be an unhealthy consumer of news. I think be credulous, be very skeptical, be very skeptical. Skepticism is something we should be encouraging from the moment that children learn to speak. We should be asking them to ask questions and be skeptical. And I think also vary your diet is the best thing you can do, because the questioner is absolutely right. Everybody calls themselves fair and balanced. Everybody presents themselves as giving the plain truth. And very few people do, because they are businesses and they need to make a profit. Politicians have a brand. They want you to consume their brand. I want you to vote for me. So I'm going to give you a brand you like. I'm going to use words like unity, the public good, the common interest. I'm going to take it to the system. I'm going to go against the establishment, even if I am the establishment, right? When Mitch McConnell talks about the establishment, it makes me laugh out loud. I mean, he is the establishment. And so know that, right? In the same way, I hope a consumer is skeptical when they're watching an ad for laundry detergent. Be that skeptical when seeing political news. Someone's selling you something. Be skeptical about it. And if we could encourage that value, I think we wouldn't need someone to save us. We don't need a billionaire to save us by scrubbing our media of things that are fake, because I don't trust that billionaire in the same way I don't trust a politician to censor my media. And so I think that, beautiful, aggressive skepticism combined with a wide diet is the best thing you can do.
Okay, I know I said that was the last question, but we do have an alumnus who posed a question very early on in your presentation. So if you have another minute.
I do.
Very good. I just want to
I've
make
got hours.
Questions keep coming in. So let's.
I have 3 kids that I'm homeschooling. So right now this is like vacation. My wife is in charge. You could take all night and all day tomorrow.
Well, I promise this will be the last question, and then we'll close things up. So the alumnus writes, given the sharp economic rightward turn of democratic political leaders in recent decades, to what extent is this partisanship performative? And that is, it is used to rally supporters rather than to advance sincerely held beliefs.
That is a really good question. And I would say that all of politics is in a way performative. And I'm thinking of like Erving Goffman's, front stage and backstage idea, that the way we perform in public, he used the example of the waiter. When you're with the customer, it's all absolutely, I'm so happy to serve you. How does that waiter talk when they're back in the kitchen? And I think every human being does this. We're performing all the time. I'm performing right now. I talk differently here than I will when I go to eat dinner with my family or when I'm watching TV at the end of the day with my wife. And I think all politicians do this. And the question is a good one, right? Because I do wonder, has the Democratic Party moved to the right on economics, or is the electorate moving left faster than the politicians are moving? And I think what we're finding right now is in both parties, the most mobilized, energetic voters are moving out faster than the parties are. So the most energetic Republicans are moving in a rather radical populist way, much faster than the establishment is, though they are very comfortable moving in that direction, at least with their verbiage. The Democratic Party, the most energetic part of the Democratic base, is moving to the left much faster than the less energetic base of the party. And so the reason why Hillary Clinton won in 2016 and the reason why Joe Biden is going to win in 2020 is because the bulk of the party is moderate. It's moderate. And the reason why Donald Trump won in 2016 is not because the bulk of the party was radical. It's because they had 17 candidates and they used a winner-take-all primary system. So what happened was, in early states, Trump would win his 25 to 30%. But because he was winning more than any other candidate, he was getting all of the delegates. So what happened was the moderate lane had many, many candidates. Do you like Chris Christie? Do you like Jeb Bush? Do you like John Kasich? The conservative lane, in the real sense of conservative, had Marco Rubio, it had Ted Cruz, it had Ben Carson. The Trump lane only had Trump. There was no other person contesting in Trump's lane. So as long as Trump got 25 to 30% of the vote, he would win, because the other lanes were clogged up. And because the Republican Party uses a winner-take-all primary system, Trump quickly amassed the delegates he needed to win. And then once he had control of the party, he was able to use that entire incredibly powerful apparatus to bend the party to his wishes. I'm not sure if I have any of those, the dying breed of the New England Republican who are watching right now. But if you are out there, I care for you. I want you to live. There's not many of you left, right? The old liberal Republican, it was Richard Nixon who created the EPA. It was Richard Nixon who signed the Clean Water Act. It was James Cleveland from the 2nd District of New Hampshire, a libertarian Republican who loved the environment, and has a letter, Hillary Cleveland in her barn has a letter from Richard Nixon to James Cleveland thanking him for his work on the Clean Water Act. That blows my mind. A Republican president thanking a Republican member of the House for his stewardship of the environment. What I'm getting at here is, I don't know that we have changed. I think what's happening is our system isn't functioning. And what was once a system designed to productively disagree has instead amplified the voices of the most extreme. I love people on the extremes, I really do, but they are not the mainstay of either party. And so on the Republican side, we really did have the most extreme voters take over the party. And we have Trump governing, I would say, not in a conservative way. He is not conserving traditions. He is not doing that slow, moderate change that someone like Edmund Burke would, or Russell Kirk would advocate. He is a radical. He is remaking DC. What did Bernie Sanders promise to do? A radical takeover of the Democratic establishment, and he would remake corporate America. He would remake the Democratic Party. The Democrats do things differently. All of their primaries are proportional. You don't win all the delegates by winning the most votes. And Joe Biden's competitors learned the lesson of 2016. They didn't hang around. The moment it was clear they weren't going to win, they dropped out and endorsed Biden. So what I would say to a Bernie Sanders supporter who's frustrated is, you have every right to be frustrated, but this was our system working the way it's supposed to work. And if our system had worked this way in 2016, Donald Trump wouldn't be the president. And I say that knowing that Donald Trump supporters would be angry about that. It would have been probably Marco Rubio or John Kasich, the most viable moderate or the most viable conservative. No offense to Ted Cruz. I do mean offense to Ted Cruz. Sorry, this is being recorded. I just don't like Ted Cruz. But I think what you find is that 2016 was an aberration, because the system really amplified the voices of 25% of the primary electorate. On the Democratic side, it's the opposite. It amplifies the voice of the established Democratic base, who are African American, elderly, Latina and Latino elderly voters are moderates. That is really the bulk of the party. If you go on Twitter, you're going to see the more engaged, active, ideological Sanders supporters, and they are a part of the constituency, but they don't make up a majority. And the way the Democrats set up their primary did not amplify their numbers. It actually said, if Sanders got 40% of the vote, he gets 40% of delegates. And over time, as Biden consolidated that non-Sanders lane, he was just winning 55-45, 55-45. And Sanders realized if he held on, all he would do is create a bitter division in the party that would most likely replicate the bitter divisions of 2016, because those divisions would be amplified by the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign loved pouring salt on those wounds, and it would lead to Donald Trump being reelected. And Donald Trump is really hoping that Sanders supporters are so turned off by how they believe their candidate was treated that they either don't vote or they cast a protest vote for a third-party candidate. And in our single-member district plurality system, a vote for a third party is an irrational vote. It is a protest vote. So if you intend to be irrational, do it. I mean, people ride motorcycles without helmets, right? People do irrational things all the time. But don't believe that you're casting a rational vote if you vote for a third party. You are lodging a protest. And that protest may lead to a person you really don't like winning election. And I say that to both Republicans and Democrats. You might not like the menu, right? But if you reject both entree A and entree B, you're going to go hungry. And you may be served an entree you really hate because you refused to accept an entree that you kind of hate. Eventually, you have to choose between this kind of cream of wheat and that kind of cream of wheat, right? You're going to get cream of wheat. So pick the one you find less objectionable. Long answer to a really good question.
Yeah, really great though. I don't want to keep our audience too late. I have to say it's been really fun watching the chat. A number of your former students have been on here making comments. Pawis was on here and extended his hello. Caitlin Hayward says, so happy to see you speak again and so enthusiastically since I graduated 7 years ago.
This is our Hall of Fame. Yes,
really great to see so many comments and engagement by our alums, your former students on here. Before we wrap up, just a reminder to everyone that this session has been recorded and we will send you the link to the recording in the coming days. You might be interested to know as well that next Friday, May 29th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be hosting another Zoom webinar, which will feature conversations with community leaders Stu Stubner, president of Colby-Sawyer, superintendent of the Kearsarge School District, Winifred Fenna, New London Town Administrator Kim Hallquist, and Tom Mannion, the CEO and president of New London Hospital. Their discussion will focus on responding to the pandemic and planning for what's next. You should all receive an email message inviting you to that session. If for some reason you don't receive the email, just reach out to us by emailing our office, alumni@colby-sawyer.edu, and we'll provide the details. As we finish up, I want to give Eric a huge thanks for taking time and for leading such a fascinating and stimulating discussion. Eric, any parting words before we sign off here?
Just, I would say the one thing I always tell my students is that institutions matter. Well-designed institutions turn rotten people into good citizens. Poorly designed institutions turn good people into rotten citizens. And so always look at the rules, always look at incentives, try to figure out how things are structured. And if you change the structure, you oftentimes can change the outcomes.
Oh, great. That's a great way to finish us up here. This officially ends our program for the evening. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We love having our former students and our friends from near and far joining us online. At the height, we had over 70 folks online with us tonight. Thank you all for your continued support, and we hope to see you on May 29th for our next session. Have a good evening, everyone. Be well and good night.